Good day. My name is Jim Gitney. I'm the CEO of Group50 Consulting. Over the last 40 years of my career in managing supply chains, I've seen significant differences. And the last 3 years have been a tumultuous time, a time like I've never seen before. We've had recessions and we had the oil embargo back in the 70s, but what we've seen over the last couple of years is unprecedented. And as supply chain leaders, we find ourselves in a position where we have to reinvent how we manage lean supply chains. And so I want to spend the next 30 minutes talking about managing lean supply chains in 2022 and beyond, and also a new idea called the supply chain hierarchy of needs. So I hope you enjoy this. Let's talk about lean supply chain management for a second and make sure we're on the same page, or at least you understand where I'm coming from when I talk about the supply chain. So the supply chain starts with raw materials. We add value and we make a product or service and we manage it and sell it to our customers. Now that's been the classic definition. I add to our supply chain management practice the management of the product out in the field till its end of life. Because at the end of the day, we do have responsibility for making sure customers can continue to interact with the product, that they can get spare parts, that they have the ability to realize more stickiness to our business. And so as a supply chain leader, we have a huge impact on how effective the business is in maintaining its customers throughout the extended life of the product. You know, inside of supply chain management, for those of us who are in the practice, we have to consider a lot of things: integration, operations, purchasing and procurement, suppliers, distribution, logistics, and customer service. And all of those things impact our effectiveness as supply chain leaders. And inside, over the last 30 years or so, lean supply chain management has been about the relentless pursuit of eliminating waste and reducing lead times. And we've done a really good job of that. It's now starting to become our Achilles heel. So we need to make some changes. The next 25 or 30 minutes, like I said, are going to be about what our recommendations are on things that we as supply chain leaders should consider. One of the things that is become apparent to all of us is that supply chain risk has significantly changed. And if you look at this chart, you can see there are 4 categories of supply chain risk. There's the standard operating issues. There are addressable risks that we have, like war and buying patterns and planning errors. And then there are things that happen that are big. I mean, they're significant. They're material to how well our supply chain runs, but we can plan for those. And then there are the ones that we can't predict, but we can expect: Mother Nature, cyber attack, pandemic, wars, geopolitics, regulation. All those things are significantly changing the landscape in which we have to operate our supply chains. And so it's become a much bigger challenge for supply chain leaders to be able to not only take care of. In lean organizations, we not only have to have barely enough people to take care of the day-to-day operations, and certainly don't have sufficient enough resources to plan for and consider the things that we need to plan for and the things that we can expect but we can't predict. You know, supply chain risk today is estimated to cost companies $5 trillion over the next 10 years. That's a huge number. That's almost 5% of global GDP. Single sourcing has significantly increased our risks, and we need to be more focused on mitigating the things that we can't control. And there are ways to do that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. One of the things that we need to keep uppermost in our mind is the business strategy and the company's most important goal. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. At the end of the day, the frequency of disruptions are increasing, which is significantly increasing the risk to our business. Now let's talk about that. Supply chain disruptions are estimated to equal 42% of 1 year's EBITDA on an average over the course of a decade. Now, For those of you who aren't finance experts, EBITDA is earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. I'm not going to spend a bunch of time explaining that. But what I am going to say is that is the classic measure of the profitability of a business when you're doing a valuation of that business. So if you sit and think about it, for half a year worth of our profit is going to be lost due to supply chain disruptions. The average company can expect to have a month or two disruption every three and a half years. And many companies don't associate these disruptions as part of supply chain cost. And I think that's a problem that needs to be resolved, because some of the things we're going to talk about in Lean Supply Chain Management 2022 and beyond are things that cost money. And so it's going to require a cross-functional effort to figure out what the fair value is of a product that we buy. And we need to finally come to the conclusion that purchase price is no longer a good estimate of fair value. We need to get into and refocus our efforts on the total cost of ownership as a way of assessing fair value as we're looking about different sourcing strategies. Medium-sized organizations are estimated to lose $184 million a year due to disruptions. And 83% of the organizations suffer damage to their reputation due to disruptions. And 90% of the companies have been impacted by these disruptions. So no matter what kind of company you're in, whether you're a service provider or you're a manufacturer, every company has a supply chain. We take raw materials, we add value, we deliver a product or service. And so the things that we're going to talk about here apply equally to both service-oriented businesses and product manufacturers. One of the things that's becoming incredibly important if we understand what kind of risks are happening in a business is scenario planning. We need to think about what are the possibilities of something happening. And if something happens, what are we going to do about it? And we need to put those into various scenarios. So as we move along the sales curve, as shown here, we move along the sales curve, we can see that there are going to be times that we need to make changes. So let's talk about the last 3 years, right? We were going along all kinds of happy. Business was good. Pandemic hit, global supply chain shut down. If we had built into our supply chain strategy scenarios of that type, we might have been able as a business to address those better. Now, supply chain shut down, demand starts picking back up. We can't get material, we can't get supplies. Why? Because we're primarily single sourced. China continues to suffer from occasional lockdowns of huge portions of its manufacturing areas. And now that supply chains are starting to come back up and they're able to provide us with the product that we have, we're now going to hit a recession, which means that we're going to see it go back down again. And so we need to make sure that inside of our supply chain planning that we've taken into account for these types of scenarios and have trigger points where we're actually going to do something when we see the numbers that measure our demand start to change significantly. And if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, you can see what the bullwhip effect looks like as we talk about these major disruptions occurring. So you need to create a model of your business or your industry, identify trigger points, review those trigger points on a routine cadence. And we're recommending that you do sales, inventory, and operational planning in 2-week sprints. Now, we'll talk about sales, inventory, and operational planning a little more in a later slide. But at the end of the day, most companies say they do it, and our experience is that most companies do it poorly. It's critically important that supply chain managers stay much closer to their customers. And I would even go as far as saying this isn't a matter of listening to the marketing and the sales guys. tell you what's happening, that you actually talk to buyers. You actually go and find out what their buying patterns look like, what their buying strategy is going to be, so that you have the ability to have a supply chain that is responsive and scalable based on the needs of your customers. And you need to understand the bullwhip effect, which actually will cause you to make changes in your inventory strategies. Having much larger inventories of longer lead time parts, shorter inventories on short lead time parts, and larger raw material inventories so that you can create product much closer to demand. So let's talk for a second about the new lean supply chain management considerations. Lean techniques and tools still apply, but they need to be adapted to new considerations. JIT isn't enough anymore. So what are some of the things we've talked about? Changing buying patterns. We've talked about disruptions. We've talked about risk mitigation. We've talked about, we need to talk about scalability. We need to talk about building agile and lean strategies into our supply chain. More on that later. And we need to make sure that we are absolutely leveraging our technology investment. You know, I like to consider myself a pretty darn good Excel user, but I'll bet I only use 5% of the tools that are available in Excel. And client after client after client that we work with is completely surprised by the capabilities of the technologies they have that they're not using and they're not leveraging. So we need to talk about that in a lot more detail. What are some of these other considerations? Well, let's move over to the right side of the chart. Most companies who manufacture products sell to other businesses. They sell direct to consumer. They sell business to consumer and retail.com. Now, what's retail.com? Retail.com is when we sell to the customer of a Walmart, or that customer comes on to walmart.com, that order's transferred to us, and we have to sell it. We sell it directly. We send it directly to that customer. And as you start adding all of these requirements inside your supply chain for Amazon and for eBay and for Walmart.com and Target.com, it requires different supply chain strategies and different methods inside your distribution centers to be able to satisfy those. We know buying patterns have changed significantly. They're up over 50%. But what's interesting is they're up over 50% for B2B buyers as well, which means that that whole landscape is changing. We are now selling products and systems. So it's not uncommon that you're going to sell a product into the marketplace and then create a longer term relationship with a customer, which means your customer service, which I consider to be part of the supply chain, needs to be robust enough to handle customer needs after the sale. Product life cycles are decreasing, as we all know, and so we have to change products all the time, which means our inventory strategies need to be robust enough to take that into consideration. And one of the things we're recommending to our customers, our clients, is what we call design for supply chain. Now, some of you might be aware of design for manufacturing and assembly, DFMA. We've added as a process design for supply chain. We think that during the product development process or the service development process, that there needs to be a formal activity where the supply chain and its future risks and its capability to react to having a component that is single source, or a component that, such as lithium, that's controlled by one or two countries. We need to make sure those discussions are happening inside the development process. And we don't know of very many companies at all who are doing this. So if you take one thing away from this time that we've spent together, I highly recommend you think about design for supply chain as a formal process. And feel free to give me a call. We'll be happy to talk about that process and how we integrate it into the stage gate process for product development. Supply chain visibility is it's no longer just to have supply chain visibility for your tier one suppliers. You need to have supply chain visibility for your tier two and your tier three suppliers. And that's especially critical for long lead time items. And one of the other things that's happening is that supply chain skill levels are changing. Our supply chain folks cannot just be purveyors of purchase orders. They need to be able to understand not only how to issue a purchase order, but how to do blanket orders, how to do flex fences, how to manage the relationship with the vendor properly. And those are all skill sets that we're finding in incredibly short demand. And I suspect you are as well. Or I'm sorry, incredibly short supply, incredibly high demand. And we need to integrate agile and lean techniques into our supply chain and sourcing of components. And we'll talk about that in a separate slide. Companies that we deal with say they do SI&OP. I haven't come across one that does it really, really well. SI&OP is considered a supply chain process. And, you know, the marketing and sales guys will get involved in it. The ops team will get involved in it on occasion, but it's like pulling teeth. And if you look at the 15 elements of the SI&OP process, it's incredibly complex. And if you're going to do a great job at lean supply chain management, you need to take into consideration all of these elements, which means that the SI&OP process needs to be elevated in terms of in the eyes of the organization, and needs to become a much more important process for senior leadership. It's worth millions and millions and millions of dollars to the company. And the really good news, if there is a silver lining in all these disruptions that have happened, the good news is that senior leaders have felt the pain from the pandemic and the disruptions of the supply chain, and are more likely than not to listen to you talk to them about why SI&OP needs to be part of senior review, or what we also call management review. Now, scenario planning, cross-functional, high level. SI&OP, cross-functional, high level. And so when you start to think about this, this plays really well into being part of a company's normal operating routine, but it needs to be incredibly more robust. And it needs to be as robust as financial reviews. If you want to differentiate yourself in the marketplace amongst your competitors, that's where SI&OP needs to reside. Let's talk about agile versus lean supply chains. Now, a lean supply chain, JIT deliveries, single sourcing, volume aggregation, planned commitments with vendors. I want this many every month. Rigid schedules and a focus on quality. That way your suppliers and their suppliers can plan appropriately and set themselves up to be able to supply product to you on a reliable cadence. Now, let's talk about agile supply chains. So an agile supply chain is one that has the ability to be able to quickly adapt to changing conditions. And so variable demand and scheduling, nearshoring, flex fence planning, which we'll talk about in the next slide. Inventory levels need to be kept at their lowest in order to allow for quick response, quick changes to production of volumes and goods. You need to have control towers in place, and you need to leverage your vendors much more than you do today. But let's give an example of an agile versus the lean supply chain. And I'm going to use my experience at Black & Decker many, many years ago. I knew I was going to make 2 million of the same widget every year. That was guaranteed. But I knew that that volume could vacillate between 1.8 million and, well, actually 2 million and 2.4 million. So I needed to have the ability to quickly react to changes in that demand. And so we set up a lean supply chain with our vendors at 1.8 million units. And then we set up alternate supply chains that could quickly respond to changes in demand with other vendors so that we could give them flash orders. And we negotiated flex fences with each one of these vendors. So what an agile supply chain and lean supply chain can actually coexist. Another example is in the housewares industry, we would design a new tabletop appliance, countertop appliance. And that countertop appliance would have a bit of risk with it. And we weren't quite sure what the volume would look like. So an example of applying agile techniques to that was we did all of our tooling in aluminum. We did soft tooling. That's only good for 40 or 50,000 shots. And so by the time we got 40 or 50,000 units into the product in the marketplace, we had a much, much better feel for what the formal demand for that product was going to look like. And we went ahead and then made the investment into hardened tooling so that we were able to have lower cost and better product. So it's important to recognize when you're sitting and talking about design for supply chain and talking about your supply chain strategy, that you take into consideration agile versus lean techniques and applying appropriately across your supply chain. Let's talk about flex fence planning. Now, it's interesting because when I meet with clients who buy product from China, they tell me the lead time is 3 months. And I go, really? Is it really 3 months? And they go, yeah, because we have to have hard orders. And we have to tell them 3 months in advance how many units we're going to buy. Now, we've created what we call the flex fence planning model and actually negotiate this with suppliers in China. As it turns out, a supplier does want to know what you're going to buy over a year. So let's use 1 million units as a number and say, I'm going to buy 100,000 units. That would be 1.2 million, wouldn't it? 1.2 million units. I'm going to buy 100,000 units from you a month. And I'm guaranteeing that. And I'm going to place a blanket order for that so you can plan appropriately. But in exchange for that, I want something back. I want the ability to be able to increase or decrease my demand prior to you shipping the product. So if you know that you have to ship me 100,000 at the end of next month, and I'm 5 weeks away, I want to be able to adjust that up or down 20%. And as I get closer and closer to the ship date, my ability to be able to adjust it up or down decreases. Now, if you sit and think about that for a second, it requires a little more inventory on the vendor's part in order to be able to manage those variations. But at the end of the day, it gives me a lot more flexibility to more properly service the actual demand in my marketplace. And so I highly encourage you to think about flex fence planning and think about the impact that it might have on how you deal with your vendors that have relatively long lead times. I actually, in our planning model, say that coming from China, our lead time is 1 month when I have this in place because I have the ability to adjust it up and down. Now, what happens if I get a huge order and I end up having to adjust it 100%? Well, that's a nice problem. That's a problem that, while it will probably keep me up at night for a few nights, is one that I'm more than happy to anticipate because all of these other little problems have gone away where I have minor variations in demand. And I think we'd all agree that 20% is not minor. One of the other things I want to talk about in lean supply chain management is how we're organized. We have a tendency to be organized functionally. We've been that way for years and years and years and years. Technology has become such an important part of everything that we do that we really need to consider about organizing around technology. And job classifications need to be technology focused. Now, I don't mean that people inside the supply chain are changing programs, installing systems, and those kinds of things. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about groups of planning experts. I'm talking about groups of MRP experts. I'm talking about groups of demand forecasting experts. I'm talking about people who are experts at leveraging the technology so that you as a supply chain leader have the ability to really understand what's happening in your supply chain and really be able to understand what things you need to change in order to be able to service the needs of your customers. And so we're actually making recommendations to organizations that they completely do away with, not entirely, but they reconsider the functional organization design and design around their technologies into two groups. The value-added group, which we show at the bottom of this chart, and the market-facing group, which is responsible for all of the things that will happen in the marketplace that will impact our supply chain and how we manage it. And do not underestimate the power of artificial intelligence and the ability of systems to be proactive and not just reactive. We were working with a client recently and they weren't using the proactive side of their ERP system at all. And they were continuously surprised by things they didn't know. And so once we made the change and got a couple of folks from what is a very large sourcing or a supply chain organization to focus on the proactive side of their technology, a lot of problems went away. The other thing I want to introduce to you is something we call the supply chain hierarchy of needs. Now, you're consultant speak 101. Okay, got it. But if you sit and think about it, a supply chain has a hierarchy of needs. There are things that you have to have in order to do your job effectively and to effectively manage a lean supply chain. And one of the things that we need to talk about are clearly defined supply chain strategies. But in order to be able to do that, I need to understand some fundamental things that aren't often communicated to me as a supply chain leader. What's the company's most important goal? If the company's most important goal is to double in size, that gives me a lot of insight as to what kind of strategy I have to have. If the company's most important goal is to harvest the business and leach out every ounce of cash I can, I have a completely different supply chain strategy. So you need to make sure that you clearly understand the company's most important goal. Because if you don't have one, you're going to be running down the path of optimizing a supply chain and maybe not optimizing it correctly, something that we call anti-strategy, but you're going to end up with a sub-optimized business as a result of it. You need to understand the business strategies. You need to understand the most important goal. You need to understand your product life cycles, and you need to understand your value proposition. These are all fundamental things in the foundation of the supply chain hierarchy of needs that you need to know before you can put together effective supply chain strategies. Then your next step is to do a gap analysis. What are the things I'm not doing well today that I need to fix? And what are the strategic gaps? What are the things that I need to do in the future that I don't have the capability of? And then that leads you to developing tactics and programs and projects around closing those gaps. And then it's really important that you have the appropriate KPIs and the appropriate goals set throughout the supply chain organization. If you don't do that, you can't measure your success. And I know most supply chain organizations don't get an A grade when we talk about what does supply chain measurement look like and how do we measure success. Now, level 2 of the supply chain hierarchy of needs is knowledge and change management. If we truly are going to reorganize and we're going to implement new technologies and leverage our existing technologies and implement new skill sets, we better make sure that we've got a really strong plan for our organization. And that includes the appropriate accountabilities, the appropriate skills, the appropriate training. We need to optimize our team around technology, and we need to make sure that we've got the appropriate compensation and succession plans in place. Because level 2 is the bridge between strategy and results. And we'll talk about that more in the next slide. But at the end of the day, if you don't bridge the gap, if you don't put enough resource and effort into managing this bridge, you are not going to get the expected results. Level 3 is all about implementation. It's Kaizen events, it's continuous improvement, it's business process reengineering, it's implementing the new organization structure, and it's all about measurement. So this is the process, the building blocks you need to have in order to properly plan a strategy for lean supply chain management and to properly execute that strategy. And don't forget the total cost of ownership, because at the end of the day, we need to value, our fair value now is around a total cost of ownership. Let's talk about change management for a second, because 90% of organizations don't implement their strategies, don't fully implement their strategies. 50% of leaders say they're terrible at implementing strategy. Why? Well, it's not because the strategic plan is bad. There are some that are bad, but the majority of them are pretty good. It's that they don't properly understand how to bridge the gap between strategy and results. They don't spend enough time, and they aren't cross-functional enough in terms of preparing the organization and providing the organization with the appropriate resources, both financial and human, in order to implement the strategy. Alignment, accountability, learning maps, skills, and implementation tools are all critical. And you as a supply chain leader need to understand and need to have a comfort level of what the tools that are being made available to you by senior leadership. Don't underestimate that. If you do, you do it at your own peril, because you will not be able to properly bridge the gap between strategy and results. So, in closing, what are some of the things we need to consider in managing lean supply chains in 2022 and beyond? Well, we highly recommend that you implement a cross-functional supply chain control tower for larger organizations. For smaller organizations, it may not be this formal, but it still needs to be at the senior leadership level. It needs to be cross-functional. They have to participate in and oversee scenario planning, the design for the supply chain, creating a supply chain risk register, which is something every supply chain organization should do, and to do total cost of ownership modeling. That is a separate function and a separate set of business processes that need to be considered in order to properly create a scalable and agile supply chain that can navigate the disruptions that we're seeing globally. We need to have a significantly more robust SI&OP process. As I'd mentioned, most organizations don't do it well. They're terrible at it. They think it's an unnecessary element. Yeah, the supply chain guys can take care of this. We don't need to be involved. But yet, other parts of the organization are first at the table when the supply chain isn't running well. So the SI&OP process needs to be much better at improving the visibility of risk. It needs to combine and take into consideration agile and lean techniques and strategies, and also have flex fence planning as part of the review. Now, the last piece I don't have in here is family planning. We have an example of a client that I worked with that wanted the marketing and sales guys to forecast every SKU. And it was a dismal failure. Why? Well, because that's not what sales and marketing guys are for. Business development people, sales, marketing, customers, that's not what they're for. What they're for is to sell. And so we integrated a model where they were only doing family planning. And it was hugely successful. And the responsiveness of their supply chain increased dramatically because of it. Now, elements of the supply chain strategy and the supply chain hierarchy of needs, business strategy and the company's most important goal, resilience, ability to be able to quickly recover from unexpected disruptions, scalability, shift to regional suppliers rather than rely on a singular global supplier, because you just don't know what's going to happen. And there are ways to cost effectively do that. You need to leverage your vendors. I can't tell you how many clients I work with who don't take advantage of the subject matter expertise inside their vendor community. I'll just share one quick example with you. We were making skirts for barbecue grills, and it had to be a certain thickness because when you move the frame around, it made a sound like an old oil can. We brought the steel manufacturer in and said, we need to reduce the amount of steel we use. And they go, well, why are you using such thick steel? And we told them, and they go, well, why don't you just put 2 creases down the center? It won't do that anymore. We cut 1.2 million pounds of steel out of our yearly consumption because of it. And as you might imagine, it became a decorative effect and allowed us to even further differentiate our barbecue grills. So it's important that you develop very close relationships with your vendors and leverage their skills and capabilities. Lastly, organize around your technology. 4 reports that organizations that embrace digital technology and digital transformation are best able to manage supply chain disruptions. So I hope you found this helpful. I could talk about this for hours, as you might imagine, but I recognize your time is precious as well. My name is Jim Gitney, and I'm the CEO of Group50 Consulting. We are supply chain operations and strategy subject matter experts, quote to cash and raw materials to finished goods. And everything we do when we work with clients is to attempt to optimize around the intersection of people, process, technology, and cobotics. And so if you're interested in finding out more about what we do and why Group50, please feel free to give me a call or drop me a line at jgitney@group50.com or call me at 626-644-9746. I look forward to speaking with you, and I hope you found this helpful. Thanks.